Welcome to The Infinite Jungle, a podcast about the evolution of Ethereum. I'm Christine Kim, VP of Research at Galaxy, and this is the very first episode of the show. I'm so excited to be launching this podcast. As you can tell, it's a little bit different from the Galaxy podcast, Galaxy Brains. It's got a different vibe. We have very jungle themes going on here. And I have dressed in a special way for this episode. I may not do this all the time, but today's a special day. We're launching the very first episode, and we've got a really jam-packed show for you today. We're going to be starting off with a summary of the All-Core Developer Consensus Call, number 126. It will forever, in my mind, be a very special call because this is the call is what we're going to be talking about on the very first episode of Infinite Jungle. And then we have a special guest joining us for the second half of the show, one of my dearly beloved colleagues here at Galaxy. Her name's Yi Tong, and she works for the Galaxy Ventures team. So excited for her to be joining us, and we're going to talk about what we think are going to be the big narratives and trends for the Ethereum ecosystem in 2024. So thank you. Thank you for joining me for the first episode. So excited to get into all things Ethereum and all things Ethereum development and growth and evolution. I need to remind you to please refer to the disclaimer linked in the podcast show notes and note that none of the information in this podcast constitutes investment advice, an offer, recommendation, or solicitation by Galaxy Digital or any of its affiliates to buy or sell any securities. Let's get started. A little bit of a summary and some major takeaways from what happened yesterday on All-Core Developer Consensus number 126. As you can see, I have my notes. Well, if you're listening to the podcast, I have my notes in front of me. You can find all these notes, the full summary of what happened on yesterday's dev call on galaxy.com. I write weekly summaries of what happens on these calls. But for today's episode, I'm going to give you a really short summary and some insights and takeaways that you won't be finding in that blog, because this podcast is all about, keeping things short, but also offering some more opinionated and insight-driven takes. So quick summary. Yesterday on the call, developers basically talked about what code changes would be prioritized for the next Ethereum upgrade, Prog Electra. Right now, developers have not implemented or activated the Dencun upgrade, which is the next immediate upgrade that will be launching on Ethereum mainnet, potentially this March. But all of the big pieces for that upgrade, the Dencun upgrade, have been more or less settled. The testing that goes into the Dencun upgrade, the EIPs, which are the EIPs, Ethereum Improvement Proposals that are going into Dencun, have already been finalized. They've been implemented in various clients, and really developers are just doing the finishing touches on the upgrade. So there's really not that much more that developers can do. They've already set the dates for the final 2 test nets where the Dencun upgrade is going to be activated before mainnet. All they really have to do now is watch those upgrades go live on the Sepolia and Holsky testnets, and if all goes well, then set a date for when the Dencun upgrade is going to go live on Ethereum mainnet, which I expect to be sometime in March. Granted, if there's no unexpected issues or bugs that they find on the Sepolia and the Holsky testnets. So all this to say, there's really not that much that needs to still be done developer work-wise for the Dencun upgrade, which is why on yesterday's call, it was the very first call where the consensus layer clients really dug into what should be prioritized for the upgrade after Dencun, called Prog Electra. And when I say consensus layer clients, because this is obviously the first episode of the show, and sometimes I'm going to be using terminology that maybe not all our listeners or viewers know, Ethereum, ever since it transitioned to a proof-of-stake protocol, consensus protocol now has essentially 2 layers, 2 core protocols. One of them is the execution layer, which is Ethereum mainnet. Ever since it launched, it's been the blockchain, the very first general purpose blockchain in the world. That is now called the execution layer. It has all of the users and the accounts and the smart contracts. All of the execution of transactions and activity happens on the execution layer. But ever since Ethereum transitioned to a proof of stake consensus mechanism, a new layer has been added to the Ethereum protocol, and that is called the consensus layer. This is how the blockchain comes to consensus, how Ethereum comes to consensus about what is the finalized record of transactions, the finalized balance of user accounts. And all of the validators, who are the new block producers of the network, are all from the consensus layer. They are all organized on the consensus layer. So this to say there's an execution layer and there's a consensus layer, and they were merged together when Ethereum transitioned to a proof of stake blockchain. And now that we have these two layers that are merged, and many people listening to this podcast, maybe if you already have a background or have been following Ethereum for a while, know that the upgrade was called the merge, essentially because we're merging, existing Ethereum with this, with the consensus layer, which is also sometimes called the beacon chain. Wow, so many terms that I just usually breeze by. But just in case, for listeners of the first episode, I really want to make sure that you guys are following and tracking with what I'm saying. And we'll maybe go over these terms again at some point on a later episode. But anyways, let's get going. So we have the consensus layer and the execution layer. And before Ethereum transitioned as a proof-of-stake consensus mechanism, you really essentially only needed to upgrade one layer. You just had Ethereum, which was the execution layer. But since the merge, now you have two layers, which is why we now have this dual naming system for upgrades. We have the upgrade that's going to happen on the execution layer, which is Prog. Yes, Prog. And then we have the upgrade that's going to happen on the consensus layer, which is Electra. And the combined name of these two upgrades, developers haven't really determined it, but I'm just going to say it here and now. It's probably Pectra. The combined name for this upgrade is Pectra. And yesterday, the consensus layer client teams talked about what consensus layer focused EIPs should be included in the Electra upgrade. Last week's call was about what EIP should be included in the execution layer upgrade, Prog. So if you're interested in learning a little bit more about what EIPs are likely to be included in the Prog upgrade, check out last week's write-up summary of that call. But this week, yesterday, because we're recording this on Friday, a day after the developer call happened, developers talked about, what code changes should be included in the consensus layer upgrade. And that is what we're going to be talking about today. That is what we're summarizing today. It was a pretty spicy call. It was a lot of debate, and this happens all the time. This happens literally all the time before an Ethereum upgrade, the scope of the Ethereum upgrade is settled. Ethereum usually has so many priorities, so many different exciting ways in which the blockchain could be made better. Scalability upgrades, ways to improve censorship resistance, ways to improve the user experience on Ethereum. And there's always very fierce, heated discussions about what should be prioritized, what is timely, and what has to be cut out because developers do not have the bandwidth to include every little thing that they want to into an upgrade. So I wasn't surprised that there was quite a lot of discussion on yesterday's call, but I was quite surprised at the leaning of developers on which code changes they were leaning towards. So getting into it, 3 EIPs were confirmed for inclusion in Electra. EIP 6110, which appends validator deposits to execution layer blocks. And the motivation for this code change is basically to reduce the complexity of client software and improve validator user experience. So, and it also has some security benefits. So it sounded to me like not a major code change for the consensus layer, but one that would give some improvements to protocol complexity on the consensus layer, which is something we all want because ever since the merge, it's like complexity doubled. You have the execution layer and the consensus layer and all of them working together. So EIP 6110, kind of a nice little way to improve how the consensus layer works and give a bit more simplicity and some security benefits. So that one makes sense, sort of, because we're going to get into some of the other ones that developers are thinking potentially to deprioritize. Second EAP that was included, EIP 7002, execution layer triggerable exits. This one is a pretty important one in my mind. This one basically allows validators to be able to trigger exits, basically trigger complete withdrawals of their stake, leaving the network, basically shutting down their operations. So a good way to explain EIP 7002, and I'm actually stealing this from Danny Ryan, who chairs the calls, because he gave pretty much an excellent explanation for this right at the call. So this is not my explanation, but it's a good one and it makes sense. When you run a validator on Ethereum, you operate that validator with two keys, two cryptographic keys. There's the active key, which you use when you're fulfilling the responsibilities of validator, proposing blocks and attesting to different blocks. And then you have a second key, which is called the withdrawal credentials, and those credentials ultimately control your stake. Ever since the launch of the Beacon chain, only the active key, only the key that you use to actively fulfill the responsibilities of a validator can trigger exits. So if that active key is lost, or if there's some sort of more dynamic relationship between who owns that key and who owns the withdrawal credentials, you could have some serious issues. And the reason why this matters broadly, not just for people who lose their keys, but also for smart contracts that take ownership of validators on behalf of users. So staking pools that are trying to minimize the amount of trust that you need in a centralized party to be able to delegate your stake to another more kind of professional staking node operator. You want to be able to trigger an exit with your withdrawal key that you own, and maybe the active key is held by a smart contract or held by a node operator that is, actively running that validator on your behalf. So EIP 7002, the ability to be able to trigger exits with not just the active key, but also with the withdrawal key, that's another kind of major important code change that is going into that seems like it's going into the Electra upgrade that developers are leaning towards prioritizing for Electra. And then the third EAP, the third code change that developers were very excited about including for Electra was EIP 7549, which is kind of another more housekeeping item that clears up some technical debt that the consensus layer has, and is a pretty minor change that only requires changes to the consensus layer. So the first two EAPs that I mentioned, it would require some changes and some updates from execution layer client teams on the EL. So it's very simple in scope, something that developers agreed could be done fairly quickly. And those were the three. Those are the three that developers were leaning towards. Now, getting into some of the ones that developers were more hesitant about, or flat out kind of thinking that they wouldn't include in Electra, were certain code changes like increasing the maximum effective balance for validators from 32 ETH to 2048 ETH, and inclusion lists, and data availability sampling, which is kind of like a scalability upgrade. So there were some pretty other big ticket items that were that developers just weren't sure about including, primarily because of the complexity of these other code changes that would be a bigger lift for developers to work on. And just because of limited time, and I want to be able to leave enough time for our really amazing guest that's coming on for the first episode of this show, I encourage people to take a look and read the content of those bigger code changes, because while it does increase, probably the time it takes for Electra to go live on mainnet, like maybe it doesn't happen this year, but next year, they are very important code changes. I would argue more important code changes than some of the ones that were approved for Electra during yesterday's call. And EIP 7002, the execution layer triggerable exits, that one is an EIP that's necessary for increasing the maximum effective balance, which would ensure that the validator set size doesn't grow too large and present problems to the network. So before we get into some of these more technical things, on the show, and we'll definitely continue to talk about Electra. Given that this was the first call where developers were talking about it, they're really just going through these code changes, giving their initial thoughts. I'm sure we're going to be talking about it more in future calls yet to come. For this upcoming week's dev call, developers are going to focus on priorities for the execution layer again. This is going to be a multi-call, topic. So, I'm excited to continue to get into it with you. If you're interested in really diving into Ethereum protocol development, how people decide what changes to Ethereum should be prioritized, what's going to go into the next upgrade, be sure to continue tuning in to this series. I'm going to be talking about it and covering it every single week. So with that, let's move on to the next part of our show. I'm going to be having Yi Tong from Galaxy Ventures to join me for the very first episode of Infinite Jungle. She's a colleague that I respect so much and that I've had the pleasure of being able to work with, discuss different ideas about Ethereum governance with. So let's get her on the show. Welcome back to the show. We are back with the Infinite Jungle, very first episode, and very first guest, Yi Tong from Galaxy Ventures. I'm so glad that you're joining me, Yi. Truly, I couldn't have planned it a better way. Yi is one of my favorite people at Galaxy. Thank you so much for coming onto the show.
Yeah, thanks, Christine, for the invite. It's fun to do my very first podcast, also for myself, with my work best friend. So, it's fun.
Yes. We're going to try and keep it a little more fun, lighter for the second half of the show, because I just did my very first kind of spiel about all core developer calls, and they can be very technical and a little bit drier in nature. So I want to try and keep this a little bit more lively, keep the listeners in.
Yeah, definitely.
So yeah, well, I mean, why don't we first start with just explaining to our audience too a little bit about how you got into the space, how you came to Galaxy Ventures, a little bit of background on what you do.
Yeah, happy to. So I discovered Bitcoin, I guess, back in college, and then a little bit giveaway, I guess, when there's a Bitcoin Expo event, and then a lot of people just use the Bitcoin that they got for boba tea and coffee. And I vividly remember that there was a cafe near the campus, and then people were using, I guess, the cafe as a way to offload the Bitcoin because they take Bitcoin as a payment, but their off-ramp got broken, and then apparently that owner make a lot of money because they didn't offload in time. And
Wait, what year was this?
I think it was 2014, 2013.
Bitcoin Expo in 2014.
No, it was not a official expo because I was taking some class at MIT back then, and then I think they had a whole event on campus, and then so I think that was kind of the very beginning of people are actually using the token to do something, and then
and things are breaking.
And that was more of a social experiment done by multiple people in the space early, and then multiple OGs, and then so I think that was a very first time for a lot of non-crypto people to get to know what is this, right? What is this internet fake money?
Yeah. And once you kind of, found out about Bitcoin, then how did you break into the crypto industry? I feel like people tell me so many kind of interesting stories, I should say, about how the crypto industry is a lot more, it's not like you apply with a resume and then you go through a couple rounds of interviews and then you start as an intern and then you move your way up. There's no career path for working in the industry. So I feel like everyone's paths are very unique. How did you break in?
I think it's more about everyone started day trading a little bit, and definitely with failures. And then with non-sleeping, and I guess back in the ICO booms, and then when first CryptoKitties start coming out, there are a lot of new things going on, and then you obviously want to know more and want to see how to get more involved and how to learn more about the technology behind it. And I think that's kind of the starting point. And then after that, got an opportunity to work a little bit officially at Coinbase, and then get more I guess, holistic view on how the ecosystem, like what are the different parts that people care about and working on, and then how do you bring more retail user to understand more about the use cases? How do we actually think about decentralized finance? How do we think about making a better financial toolings accessible for every people, like for all the people in the world? And then I think that's kind of the starting point. And then I guess how I got into crypto venture is more because I was also thinking about doing projects, and then I got to like learn a bit more about like building, and also like how do I actually scale that ability, and then to learn more about working with multiple projects, and then have the ability to talk to Galaxy Venture at the time.
And within kind of your venture journey, how did you gravitate towards um, topics like ZK, like zero knowledge, and more kind of like what's happening in the application layer of Ethereum? Because
Hmm.
I think we have, your post
Hmm.
talking about zero knowledge technology
Hmm.
on galaxy.com for people who want to check it out. But also, I've just had conversations with you about different roll up projects that are being built on Ethereum,
Hmm.
and your knowledge of what's going on in Ethereum is so deep. Like, how did you kind of like gravitate and specialize in this part of ventures? I'm sure there's just an overflowing amount of projects and different like mini industries that you could kind of specialize in. Like,
Hmm.
why zero knowledge? Why Ethereum? Why applications?
Yeah, I think I'm not a maxi by any means, but I'm also like just kind of driven by interest. I discovered ZK, I guess, in when I was visiting Zuzalu, and then there are a whole series of ZK workshop, and a lot of cryptographers were there, and then they're talking about what they've been working on and the applications, and what ZK means for for L2s, for Ethereum's, what does it mean for itself standalone, and then I think I learned a lot through that process, and then also like I guess in that time period, I realized that it's actually a great way to for us to be able to think about scaling solution for Ethereum, and then how we can actually start to think about doing a lot of the off-chain compute, but are able to prove what have happened off-chain and settle that back on-chain. So I think these are like, how do you actually verify things that have happened elsewhere, but be able to utilize that results confidently? And then so these are kind of like the initial like sparkles that get me more interested, and then I guess diving deeper into that, and then obviously comparing optimistic rollup and ZK rollup, where the ZK rollup costs are intrinsically higher because you have verification costs. That got me thinking, how can we make it more accessible for everyday usage, and then how do people are like how can people confidently use ZK proofs for different application when things like you want to verify your age, you want to verify your like identity, you want to show who you are without having to show people your driver's license, your passport, but you want to contribute that piece of data so that you're qualified for something, so you're able to unlock some new identity, new utility on chain, and then be able to interact with other application to consume that as input. I think that's super powerful, and then enables users to kind of access a wider range of use cases.
You are asking all the right questions. You have the mind of a researcher, Yi, truly. And I do want to go into a little bit of your takeaways for this year,
Hmm.
especially what you think are going to be the biggest questions for Ethereum, any kind of insights you have on developments in the ZK space that we might see this year, any
Hmm.
improvements to scalability we might see this year.
Hmm.
Would love your take on rollups.
Hmm.
But one thing I want to double click on that you
Yes.
said that our listeners probably might not know,
Uh-huh.
but is actually a very unique and kind of strange thing. Um, the Zuzalu conference. What
Yes.
is that? And just explain it. Like, explain what happened, like what it is to our
I
audience.
would not call it a conference.
Okay, it's not a
I
conference.
think, yeah, it's more of, I mean, I think some people call it network state. I think it just, a time and place where people, I guess it's kind of like a capsule, and then very remote, and then everyone are able to chat freely about what they build on. Not even necessarily in crypto, but they just are able to kind of live together, get to know each other, and then collaborate more freely without agenda, and then to chat more about what actually motivate them as a human being, and then to share their research, to share their lifestyle, to share their thesis, and then collaborates. And I feel like that's actually, you're going in not knowing what it is. And then I think everyone's experience there is different, but ultimately your takeaway is that you're able to learn a lot more that you don't even know that you want to learn. And then I feel like exploring the unknown, that's super exciting for me. And then obviously we met a lot of like really amazing people there, and then are able to learn a lot more about, deeper, harder, like academic questions that, people are actively working on, and you are able to scratch the surface and then to learn more about, okay, how do we actually integrate it in real life? How do we think about the existing bottlenecks that we have with all the, all the questions that we've been thinking on Ethereum or on other chains? Like, why are we thinking about, like, how are we thinking about like roll-up wars, right? If there's a war. And then
Oh, there
so,
definitely is.
I know, I feel bad saying that. And then, so like, I think this is kind of like how we kind of compartmentalize about all different active solutions that people are working on, and then marry that with all the potential, interesting solution that people are actually needing, and then how do we kind of market make that?
That sounds very fun, but also the first thing that I was thinking when I heard about Zuzulu and
Yeah.
People, Ethereum researchers and developers and different people in our ecosystem, just up and leaving for a month and like going to a completely new country. I think it was in Montenegro this year.
Yeah.
I was like, do you guys not have full-time jobs? Like, what about your families? What about your life? Like, you're just gonna up and leave?
Yeah.
But I hear you. I hear it's like a nice little pop-up community.
Yeah, it's a very idealistic pop-up community, and I think everyone had a lot of fun. Yeah, I wish I was able to stay longer, but obviously.
Would you go again this year?
I would love to.
If it happens?
Yeah, I would love to.
Is it going to happen? Do you know?
Oh, I think it's happening, and I think it's happening at different form, like I guess different form factor, because I think there was smaller like Hacker Week in Singapore, and there's like different events. So I think there's like a whole suite of events, but I don't know when the official event is going to happen.
Okay, yeah. I'm definitely looking forward to DevCon this year, which
Yeah.
is a conference and is more what you're thinking when I say the word conference. Very, very vanilla,
Yeah.
I mean, I guess not vanilla in the sense that it's a conference about Ethereum, which is an infinite jungle. Haha. Or it is kind of a crazy, wild technology.
Yeah.
But a conference in the sense that there's like speakers and talks and main stage, keynotes, whatever, firesides. Anyways, okay,
Yeah.
that was a little bit of sidebar. However, let's get back into what you're kind of predicting for this year for the Ethereum ecosystem.
Ooh, we're going back to the prediction market.
Yes. Well, nobody make any bets off of this.
Not
This
financial
is
advice.
not financial advice. But you are so knowledgeable on what's going on in the ecosystem, and I feel like you are asking the right questions of why this technology matters, what are the trade-offs and benefits with other technologies. And you had mentioned, there definitely is a roll-up war. We are going to say the quiet thing loudly on this podcast.
Exactly.
What do you think is gonna happen with kind of like the broad evolution of the layer 2 ecosystem on Ethereum? What are your predictions about where the ZK where ZK tech is going to be, most used, where the narrative around ZK is going to be kind of taking off this year?
Yeah, I mean, I think, we are getting a lot more roll up, and then there are a lot more TV out, regardless whether it's a good benchmark or not. But, there's a lot more development that's happening. And then a lot of things that we hypothesized on a couple of years back is now becoming reality. And then a lot of things are going into production. So I think all in all, super exciting progress. And then I can't believe this is the reality that we live in right now. And
are you thinking about ZK EVMs, or are you thinking about something else? Like
no,
Scroll?
I just think that like in general, we're seeing the standardization of L2 and the customization at the same time. And then obviously there's a lot of roll up as a service, and then people are embracing the modularity paradigm, and then thinking about how can you customize each layer in like data availability, execution, and settlement. And then the ultimate question of like which layer will accrue more value, and then like how do you think about like how do you choose your stack, and how do you differentiating from other L2? I think these are the questions that people are constantly thinking about. And then obviously like thinking about like how do you choose as a dApp developer, right? Do we ultimately face the problem of like fragmenting liquidity, and then you're choosing one over the other, or there's going to be better interoperability across rollups. So ultimately, you will be able to deploy to multiple chain and then have users in each pod in some sense. So I think these are kind of open questions, which I don't have a good answer to. But I think I can see a way where, you know, there will be more use case specific rollup that could be more appealing to existing businesses that with a lot of users already. And then because of the setup of the rollup is suitable for their traffic, for their user pattern, for their demographic, and then they will have incentive to migrate towards certain L2s over the others.
Yeah, I mean, I agree with you. I think that modularity, the way that people are really warming up to this idea of modularity and like and expanding the layer two ecosystem, thinking about that modular stack of like, you know, like how can I make like what layer should I launch my application? It's now no longer just like I'm launching it on Ethereum. It's like, well, maybe I launch it as its own L3, or I launch it on top of Optimism and not Arbitrum. Like the optionality of how you build your product, your blockchain based application, is really just it's kind of exploding, and like you said, in customizability. And actually, shout out to the Roll Call series, which is a developer call series just for layer two protocols, to kind of create standardization between the layered ecosystems, between the L2, between different L2s. So I'd like to also see that kind of standardization. So one of the things that I feel like people are really anticipating a lot this year, and kind of thinking is going to be a big deal when it happens, is the launch of EigenDA. And we were talking a little bit, you one of the questions that you had mentioned that you're thinking about is like, where does value accrue the most? And when EigenDA launches, do you suspect that, you know, it's going to, you know, materially impact or change kind of like the layered ecosystem on Ethereum? Is it going to impact rollups? Is it going to impact staking? Is it going to impact like validators? Like, I personally feel like for EigenDA, when it first launches, it's not going to have a really big impact because of how limited deposits are. So the number of people that can actually validate and restake to EigenDA will be capped. It's not going to be like all of Ethereum stake. It's probably going to be like maybe, you know, less than 5% of total Ethereum staked, you know, actually getting additional rewards from EigenLayer, even though they are kind of increasing their caps pretty like faster than I expected, even before the launch of EigenDA. But I can't imagine. But anyway, so I think that like, you know, the amount of economic security that's actually securing EigenDA will be very small to start off with. I'm not 100% sure if we need more DA layers right now. We've got, obviously, Ethereum's the most expensive. We've got Celestia. Very excited to see how Celestia will be, kind of how Celestia is going to be used. And then EigenDA. But there's also like Avail and a bunch of other DA layers. So do you think that EigenDA is going to be kind of like as big of a deal as people are talking about?
I think competition is always healthy, right? And then
period.
So and I think that like, you know, there are also different like intrinsic setup for each DA, and then I think EigenDA potentially offers more customization towards whether you will have a DAC or not, and then how many validators in that, how you want to lower your cost for your DA by choosing smaller sets. So I think, you know, in a way, for different rollups for different focus and different, I guess, use cases. For example, if you're building a rollup for games, for a very niche game, that's very different, I guess, consideration and design decision to be made comparing to if you're building a large-scale DeFi application. And I feel like that level of, like, I guess, degree of freedom is going to be helpful for when people choose between different DA. And I think another thing is that, like, the network effect, for it to be one of the AVSs on top of EigenLayer, depends on actually what their slashing condition is, which I'm actually super curious about. So, like, how people would risk their underlying assets and to secure different type of AVSs, and then to understand like what that implication might be, and then that could also affect, I guess, the supply side of EigenDA, right? Because I think it's going to be a two-sided market, and then people will have different incentive to participate.
Yeah, yeah, 100%. And kind of as background for our listeners, AVSs, it stands for actively validated services, actively validated services. But it's basically like what different kinds of protocols can you restake to?
Yes.
You can restake and earn additional yield to eigenlayer, or sorry, not eigenlayer, eigenDA, or you could restake to potentially a different AVS.
Mhm.
And that I think that will probably be the thing I'm most interested in seeing of
Yeah.
like what are the slashing, like the additional slashing
Where
requirements
do
that
they
you're going to
go?
take, that you're going to be where
We
where
burn them.
there I'm going to lose all my money. No,
Oh.
let's not have a repeat of that.
Yeah.
Well, yeah, but like obviously you are going to have more. You're gonna have to take on higher risk. You're gonna have to take your 32 ETH, that's staked on Ethereum right now. If you want to restake to eigenDA, you're
Mhm.
gonna have to have higher slashing penalties, like higher slashing. What do you call it? Like a punishment,
Yeah.
to keep yourself
Assets at
honest.
risk.
Yeah, assets as risk. And I wonder what those additional, like how extreme those additional requirements will be. And I think that will really dictate to what extent a validator node operator will want to even restake. And it has to be like the rewards have to also be high enough that they kind of outweigh or like at least compete well with the risks. And
Yeah.
it's definitely a fascinating way to kind of rethink tokenomics, like
Yeah.
rethink the security, rethink how tokenomics should be done for new protocols.
Yeah.
You're no longer just like everybody bootstrap my protocol by by basically restaking into this ecosystem. It's like let's use the existing stake of Ethereum, but put all these additional like rewards and additional slashing, additional penalties, and see if we can repurpose that economic security of Ethereum. But I think that just introduces so many. It's going to require a lot of trial and error to figure out, and until you to really hit that right balance,
Yeah.
you could see a bunch of imbalances
Yeah.
that
Yeah.
incentivize people to either that incentivize people maybe to rug the protocol or like rug certain AVSs. We're not saying which one.
Yeah.
Just saying that this is a risk that everybody should be aware of.
Yeah, exactly. I agree with everything you said. And also, I think like in some way, it's much easier to see how high the reward/yield is going to be, but it's much harder to interpret the risk that you're getting yourself involved. Yeah. So I think, I guess, more transparency towards that, better system to help people evaluate the risks that get involved into restaking with each AVSs. I think that's going to be critical and it's going to be helpful.
Yeah, there was, oh my gosh, I can't believe I'm blanking on the name, but I think there is a project that is only doing, information services for eigenDA AVSs, like people that are wanting to be eigenlayer node operators.
Yeah.
Some kind of a monitoring or information service. But to your point, like those projects, I think are going to be really important.
Anyone who is credibly neutral will help us.
Well,
find
speaking of being credibly neutral, I feel like it's almost impossible not only to be credibly neutral in this space, but also to be what's it called? Credibly aligned, or like there's this term going on in Ethereum where you have to be Ethereum aligned. Is that the term?
Yeah.
Anyways, aligned with the values of Ethereum, and it's hard for me to understand what really are the values of such a decentralized and kind of diverse ecosystem. But anyways, so we talked a little bit about restaking, talked a little bit about zero knowledge. Well, I mean, what are any other kind of like predictions or narratives regarding ZK or some of the other things that you're really looking forward to this year that you want to kind of highlight to our listeners?
Yeah, I think we kind of skipped on that earlier. I think Polygon released something yesterday about like the aggregation layer, and I think that's going to be super exciting for the ZK space as well, because I think that itself being not so much like a narrative, but I think it's just like a way for people to think about how do all the like ZK proofs coming from different proving system, how are we thinking about like processing them? How can we make it more accessible? So I think for the aggregation layer, they're basically talking about how can we amortize the cost, and then how can we batch the ZK proofs and then be able to verify them all at once, and so that each verification is going to be cheaper. And I think that could be super interesting. I mean, like aside from Polygon, there's Niba who's also working on it, and then there's also like a lot of the active discussion within the Ethereum community as well. So like, how do we actually make proving like how do we actually abstract the proving verification and then make sure that like each proof costs less. However, you don't have to think about what these each proof are for.
So the aggregation concept that you're talking about, that Polygon had come out with yesterday, it's to do with decreasing the proving to costs for zero knowledge, zero knowledge verification.
So the aggregation layer is just so that you can actually aggregate all different proofs and batch them instead of verify them individually. So before you put them on chain, you can actually you can lower the cost. For example, if you want to verify something like through WorldCoin, each verification is going to cost you I don't know, like $10. And then, however, if you're able to batch multiple verification proof, then it's going to cost $2 per. However, how many demands there is for a single application, probably not so much in the beginning. And I think, finding use cases for ZK application and ZK infrastructure has always been a hot discussion. But if we have different ways that come up with a different aggregation layer or aggregation middleware so that proofs from multiple application, different use cases can be aggregated together before they've been, so they can be batched together and then verify all at once. And then so it doesn't require so much traffic and volume from all different application to happen. And then in that way, you can amortize the cost, and then you can amortize the verification. You don't have to wait so long, and then you can shorten the time period.
That's wild to me. I thought, I mean, if what I'm understanding correctly, if I'm understanding this correctly, it's like taking the different proofs of transaction activity happening on different zero knowledge applications, and instead of each individual application or layer of protocol having their own, zero knowledge, almost proving system, you just put it onto a shared zero knowledge proving settlement system. You just are able to put it all kind of similar to what I think about batching transactions from layer 2s to layer 1. It's like instead of having your own siloed ecosystem of transaction verification and finalization, you're kind of piggybacking off of an existing one. So the aggregation layer of ZK, that's wild to me, because I totally thought that all of the zero knowledge kind of proving activity happens on very customized circuits. So being able to just generalize them and have one aggregator be able to prove all of them that's crazy. Wow.
I think it's not yet a reality, but I think it's a research topic that people have been working towards. And I'm by no means an expert, but I think the challenges that you mentioned about verifying proofs coming from different ZK circuits, I think that's absolutely right. But I think, being the aggregation layer, the goal here is just to be able to consolidate not all of them, but certain types of ZK circuits or, certain type of applications so that they can actually can do batch verification.
Wow.
And then recursively prove a lot of the, I guess, how the batch verification will work is that I guess proof coming from different ZK circuits will be able to verify all at once. And then potentially that will be a reality soon.
That's very exciting research. I was thinking that the really the cutting edge of what we can expect out of zero knowledge technology and zero knowledge proving systems is just kind of costs being, obviously this is a way to reduce costs, but I definitely did not think that it was, this, we were getting to the place where we could kind of aggregate the proofs, the ZK proofs from different types of applications. But that's so exciting to hear.
Yeah, it's kind of like a school bus. If you're only waiting for your own school bus, and then you'll have to wait for a very long time. But if you can take any bus from nearby schools, it's gonna be shorter wait time. Hopefully, infra costs will be lower. I mean, it's not a right analogy, but it's kind of like you're thinking about how can we batch, proofs from different systems, in this case, different schools, and then help them actually get back on chain.
I guess it kind of makes sense, though. It's kind of like putting the logic of, what we're doing with layer twos anyways.
Yeah. But the interesting
applying it,
problem there is that, like, I guess with that aggregation layer, how is the sequencing going to work? And then is there going to be different, like, MEV paradigm involved? I don't know.
Yeah. Well, I'd very much like to, at the very least, see some of these zero knowledge rollups really get off the ground. I mean, independently, I would like to see just even some independent zero knowledge applications start to get some real usage and traction, and would like to see some of these projects really get off the ground in 2024. So
yeah, definitely. I think I guess this is sidetracking a little bit, but I do think that ZKP has a lot more use case outside of crypto as well.
Totally. Yeah. 100%. Well, this has been such a lovely conversation, Yi.
Yeah.
And truly, I feel like I need to look more into aggregation. That will definitely be a follow-up item for me based on this conversation. But any other kind of final kind of thoughts or kind of sentiments that you want to share about where you see like the Ethereum ecosystem heading this year?
I think, definitely, as you said, a lot of the focus, is evolved like EigenLayer ecosystem overall. And then there has been a lot of new different type of like restaking protocol. In some way, a different way to think about it's kind of just different structured products. And then not to sound too financy, but I think that kind of helps people to understand what they can do with their stakees and all the liquid staking. I think that's going to be one of the main things that people are already anticipating. And then obviously with ZKP, I think that just means to further think about scaling, and then post the EIP 4844 upgrades. People are thinking about how how much transaction is going to cost, and then whether like transaction, like the saving on the fee, is it going to be going back to the user, or how do we think about like margins, like operating margins for each L2, and then whether that's going to affect users' decision, or developers' decisions on which L2 that they deploy into. And then so I think these are all super interesting. And then obviously, I guess overall there's a lot more interesting things going on in the stablecoin space as well, and then going into real world assets and securitization of assets. So I think it's going to be a good year.
That was a lot. Yes, a lot to look forward to this year.
Yeah.
And definitely on this show specifically, we'll get into some of those topics like EIP 4844, especially when Dencun launches, activates on mainnet. We'll definitely be keeping an eye on that. And we've got to have you back to talk a little bit more about stablecoins and some of these other topics later this year. So, and speaking of real world assets, we actually have a report out on real world assets this week by Zach Picarni. I did not set her up for that one. Yeah. But again, these are topics that we'll be keeping a close eye on. So thank you. Thank you
for having me. This is super fun.
No, I'm glad you were on. Thank you for coming onto the show. And we'll definitely have to have you back to talk to check in again about some of the things we talked about, especially aggregation.
Yeah, absolutely. I think we should rewatch this episode a year from now and see how things are going.
Yeah. Check in on our predictions.
Yeah.
Amazing. Well, thank you so much, Yi, and thank you so much for people who tuned in for the first episode of Infinite Jungle. This is a weekly series, so we'll be back again next week with another All-Core Developer Call summary and hopefully another amazing guest. And if you like the episode, please be sure to subscribe. Please be sure to like it. I think if it goes on YouTube, like it. Subscribe, do the things, share. Click the buttons. Yes. And we'll see you guys next week.